Welcome to Stillwater Chronicles. Tonight, we settle into a story about a door that should never open. There is a particular kind of house that remembers, not the way people remember, with warmth or nostalgia, or the comfortable blur of time. Houses remember differently. They hold things in their walls, in the grain of their floors, in the faint smell that rises on cold mornings from rooms that have been closed too long. They keep what was given to them. They do not let go. Sylvia had grown up in such a house. It stood at the end of a long, unpaved road in rural Flanders, surrounded by flat fields that turned silver in winter and deep, heavy green in summer. The house itself was not beautiful. It was large and practical, and old, the way farmhouses in that part of the world tend to be. 3 stories of dark brick with narrow windows and a roof that had been repaired so many times it had become a kind of patchwork record of every storm that had passed over it. It did not look haunted. It looked endured. Inside, the staircase was the first thing you saw when you came through the front door. A wide staircase with dark oak banisters and, running all the way up both walls, framed photographs. Every generation. Back to the 1880s. Men and women and children in their Sunday best, looking out at you with that particular stillness of old photographs. Unsmiling, patient, slightly severe. They watched you come in. They watched you go up to bed. They watched the house live around them, unchanging in their frames, while everything else moved on without them. Sylvia knew most of their names. Her grandmother had told her. This one married a man from Ghent. This one died in the war. The first one, not the second. This one outlived 4 of her children and never spoke of it. She had learned these stories, the way children learn the shapes of familiar rooms, without trying to, simply by being present. The basement door was at the back of the kitchen. It was a heavy door, oak with iron fittings, and a bolt on the outside the width of her forearm. Her great-grandfather had installed that bolt in 1952. She knew this because her grandmother had told her, the same way she had told her everything about the house, matter-of-factly, without drama, as though it were simply a feature of the building, like the low ceiling in the upstairs bathroom, or the window in the parlor, that never quite shut, flush. He sealed it, her grandmother had said once when Sylvia was perhaps 9 years old and had asked why the door was always locked. And it stays sealed. Sylvia had not asked why. Even at 9, something in her grandmother's tone had told her that why was not a question that would be answered. But there was something else her grandmother had done. Every year, on the 14th of March, she would sit in the kitchen from the time the sun went down until the time it came up again. Every light in the kitchen on. The overhead fluorescent that buzzed slightly. The small lamp on the counter. The light above the stove. All of them burning together, filling the room with a flat, even brightness that left no shadow anywhere. She would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold, and she would not speak, and she would not sleep, and she would not explain. Sylvia's mother had done the same. Once, when Sylvia was a teenager, she had come downstairs at 2 a.m. and found her mother at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a cup, staring at the basement door. She'd not turned when Sylvia came in. She had simply said, very quietly, "Go back to bed." And Sylvia had. She was 34 years old now, and her grandmother was gone, and her mother lived in Bruges with her second husband. And the house, the family house, the house at the end of the unpaved road, had passed to Sylvia, because she was the one who had stayed. Or perhaps because she was the one the house had kept. She was not sure anymore which of those things was true. She had moved in the previous autumn, and the house had received her the way it received everything. Quietly, without ceremony, simply folding her into its ongoing existence as though she had always been there. She repainted the kitchen. She had the roof looked at. She learned which floorboards creaked and which windows stuck and which rooms went cold first when the temperature dropped. She learned the house's silences, and they were many. She did not think much about the basement door. Or rather, she thought about it the way you think about something you have decided not to think about, which is a kind of thinking all its own. On the 13th of March, she checked the bolt before going to bed. She was not sure later why she had done it then, on that particular evening. She had not checked it before. It was possible she had simply walked past the door at the right moment, in the right state of mind. And some instinct, some residue of inherited knowledge, had made her stop. She placed her hand on the bolt. It was cold, the way iron goes cold in an unheated room. Solid. She pushed it to the right and heard the soft, heavy click of it, seating fully into the strike plate. Properly locked. She gave it a single small push to confirm, and the door did not move. She went to bed. The house settled around her as it always did at night. Small sounds of wood contracting in the cold, the distant sound of wind across the flat fields, the faint creak of the staircase that had no cause she'd ever been able to identify. She lay in the dark and listened to these sounds the way you listen to familiar music, finding the rhythm of them, letting them carry her toward sleep. She dreamed of her grandmother sitting at the kitchen table. In the dream, her grandmother's hands were folded in her lap, and she was very still, and she was looking at the door, not with fear, with something more like attention, the focused, patient attention of someone waiting for something they know is coming, have always known was coming, and have simply decided to be present for. Her face was calm. Her cup of tea sat untouched on the table beside her. The kitchen lights were very bright. Sylvia tried to speak in the dream, but her grandmother raised one hand, not sharply, just slightly, a small gesture of quiet, and Sylvia understood, without knowing how she understood, that speaking was not the right thing to do here. That silence was what the moment required. She woke just before dawn. The room was gray and still. She lay for a moment listening to the house. Everything was quiet. Then she got up and went downstairs and walked into the kitchen. The basement door was open. Not wide open, just ajar. Perhaps 10 centimeters. The bolt was drawn back, retracted cleanly into the plate as though someone had simply reached over and slid it aside. The door rested open at that small angle. And from the gap came a cold that was different from the cold of the kitchen. Heavier, older, with a faint smell underneath it that she could not immediately name. Something mineral, something damp, something that reminded her, very faintly, of turned earth. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time. The lights were off. She had not turned them on when she came downstairs, because the gray dawn light was sufficient, because it had not occurred to her that she might need them. She stood in that gray light and looked at the open door and felt something she could not quite classify as fear, because it was too quiet for fear, too still. It was more like recognition, the feeling of a word you have always known suddenly appearing in a language you thought you'd forgotten. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about all those years, all those 14th of Marches. Her grandmother sitting in this kitchen with every light burning and her hands around a cold cup of tea, and her eyes on this door, watching, waiting, making sure. Making sure of what, exactly? Sylvia took a step forward, then another. She crossed the kitchen to the door and stood in front of it, close enough now that the cold coming from the gap touched her face. She looked at the bolt. The iron was smooth, where the years had worn it, and there were small scratches along the length of it. Old scratches, she thought, made by something she could not identify, which she preferred not to think about too carefully. The door itself was thick and dark, with age. The grain of the wood pronounced under her fingertips when she touched it lightly. She looked at the gap. Beyond it was dark. Just dark. The particular darkness of underground spaces, which is not like the darkness of an unlit room, but somehow denser, as though the air itself has weight. She could see nothing. She could hear nothing from down there. No drip of water, no sound of settling stone, no movement, just the dark and the cold and that faint smell of earth. She did not go down. She stood there for a long time, her hand on the door, and she thought about her great-grandfather, who had sealed this door in 1952 and never explained why. She thought about the bolt, which she herself had checked last night and found properly fastened. She thought about her grandmother's hands, folded, patient, watchful. She thought about the way this family had always known things without speaking them, had always understood certain truths, not by being told, but by being present, by being carried forward into them, the way water is carried, without choosing, without asking. She thought about what it means to keep something sealed, and what it means when the sealing doesn't hold. She pushed the door gently closed. The sound it made was soft. A small, careful click. The sound of something returning to where it had been. She slid the bolt back across and felt its seat in the strike plate. The same solid resistance she had felt the night before. She stood back. And then, because she did not know what else to do, she did what the women of this family had always done. She put the kettle on. She turned on every light in the kitchen, the fluorescent overhead, the small lamp on the counter, the light above the stove. She filled a cup with tea. She sat down at the kitchen table, her back straight, her hands wrapped around the warmth of the cup, and she looked at the door. The clock on the wall read 5:43 a.m. The lights hummed. Outside, the fields were still and gray, stretching out flat and quiet under a sky that was just beginning to pale. A crow called once somewhere distant and then was silent. The house settled with its small sounds. The radiator clicked. The window in the parlor, the one that never quite shut flush, breathed slightly in its frame. Sylvia watched the door. She was not sure what she was watching for. She was not sure she wanted to know. But she understood now, sitting in this kitchen in the gray early light, that this was what you did. This was the thing that had been passed down to her, not with words, but with example, with those years of witnessed silence. You sat. You kept the lights on. You stayed present. Whatever was down there, whatever had been down there since before her great-grandfather, had sealed the door. Whatever came to the edge of that darkness once a year on the 14th of March, and did not come further, or had not come further, or had not come further yet. You did not ignore it. You acknowledged it. You met it with light. The sun came up slowly, the way it does in winter in that part of Flanders. Not dramatically, not with any particular warmth, but with a gradual gray insistence, filling the fields with a flat, pale light that was better than darkness, even if it was not quite bright. The kitchen window filled with it. The shadows on the walls softened and retreated. Sylvia sat until the clock read 7:15. Then she stood and stretched and poured her cold tea down the drain and looked at the basement door one final time. The bolt was fastened. She went upstairs. She showered. She came back down and made breakfast. Eggs, bread, the small mechanical motions of an ordinary morning. And she did not think too hard about the night that had just passed, or what it meant, or what would happen next year. But before she left the kitchen, she stopped. She looked at the photographs on the staircase wall. All those faces, all those generations, men and women who had lived in this house and known its silences and kept its vigils and sealed its doors, who had sat in this kitchen, perhaps in this exact chair, on this exact date, with the lights burning and their hands around cups of tea, watching. They looked back at her, unsmiling, patient, slightly severe, and Sylvia thought, not for the first time, but for the first time with full understanding, that some things are not passed down because they can be explained. Some things are passed down because they must be carried. Because the carrying itself is the point. Because there are doors in this world that cannot be left unwatched. And the watching is the only answer anyone has ever found. She went to work. And the house stood at the end of its unpaved road, as it had always stood, holding what it held, keeping what it kept, waiting for the 15th of March, when it would be quiet again. Until next year, thank you for listening to Stillwater Chronicles, where even the oldest houses carry their secrets quietly. If this stillness stayed with you, if the cold from that open door lingered just a moment longer, then let it remain. Some doors are sealed for a reason, and some vigils are kept, generation after generation, not out of fear, but out of love. Rest now. The lights are still on.